Yesterday, I saw the film Inside Out 2, an animated film about emotions. Now, after I'd seen this, a friend of mine asked, Kieran, I'm paraphrasing here, Kieran, you know about all these emotions, you're a psychologist, you know about these feelings and such. Does this film actually match the modern science of emotion? Now, that was a hard question, so I had to think about that for a while, and the answer surprised me, because the answer was mostly yes. In this video, I'm going to tell you about how this film handles the psychology of emotion and where it gets much of it right. So the idea of the film is there's this girl called Riley, and in her mind there are these different emotions, and they kind of work in a control panel, kind of like the control panel in a factory, to influence her behavior. What's happening in this second film is she's going through adolescence, through puberty, and now she has to deal with some new emotions that are coming in, which are ennui, which is a bit like boredom, envy, embarrassment, and anxiety. I absolutely loved, and I was very impressed with the way that anxiety was portrayed and handled in this film. One thing that I really loved about this film is the way that the emotions were shown influencing decisions, because there's this common sense idea that you've got your reason here in your head and your emotions in your heart. Reason versus passion. And that idea is nonsense. I've made a whole video about that if you want to find out more. So if you're making a decision, what's happening is you're taking in information, and then there's a bunch of responses that you could carry out, and you are going to enact a response which moves you closer toward a particular goal. And what the emotions are doing is they're setting up the motivation to move you toward that goal. One thing that the film and its predecessor did well was to state the job that these emotions had. The job of fear is to keep Riley safe. The job of disgust is to make sure that she's not poisoned or socially ostracized. And so what's happening is that it's the emotions that are making the decisions. The emotions aren't just noise that blind your thinking. What they are, you can think of them as pre-existing programs in your mind that are moving you toward particular goals. That's the functionalist kind of Darwinian theory of emotion. What about the emotions which were shown? Does this actually match the psychological theories of emotion in terms of how many emotions there are? Well, you want to get your measures right, because if your measures are nonsense, then your findings are going to be nonsense as well. So a measure can be either categorical, different categories like species, cat, dog, badger, etc., different things, or a measure of something you're measuring could be continuous or a longer dimension, such as visible light. So light is in a rainbow. Blue kind of melds into green. They're not separate colors. They kind of mix into each other. Now, the difficulty is that there are differences in psychological theories about whether emotions are categories or whether they are continuous. An example of a continuous theory of emotion is Russell's model of emotion. I believe that's from back in the 1980s, that emotions, or at least affects, how you feel, differ from positive to negative, which is moving you toward things or moving you away from things, and also in terms of physiological arousal, which is the level of physical excitement. That's how much your heart is pounding, how your muscles feel tense during, for example, intense excitement and anxiety. That's a dimensional model. One-dimensional model of emotion, following on from that, is Feldman Barrett's constructed theory of emotion, which is that you have all these different affects, all these different feelings, states of physiological arousal and motivation, but what we call emotions are actually categories that your mind has kind of artificially constructed. I remember in my life there's a whole bunch of occasions in which my heart was pounding and there was something very scary over there and I wanted to run away. And other people tell me, oh, they felt the same thing. And so what we do is we lump that into a category that we call fear. Emotions are actually categories that the conscious part of your mind has made up to simplify the world. In the same way that you have the spectrum of visible light, it's continuous, we can kind of break it up into, simplify it artificially into the categories of blue and green and red, etc. This film is not following that dimensional model. Instead, it's following the categorical model, one of which is the theory of basic emotions. There's X number of emotions. One theory of that kind is Ekman's basic emotion theory. Now, what Ekman was doing is he was studying how many emotions people had based on facial expressions, because one job of emotions is to express motivation. This situation is scary. You've wronged me and I feel angry. And so, if something's an emotion, then it would have a unique facial expression. And so, what Ekman found is that there were a set of emotions which had unique facial expressions, which are actually the 5 emotions that we have in this film. Happiness, which here is renamed joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear. Now, there are different taxonomies. There are other researchers such as Lazarus and Panksepp who've come up with different taxonomies of emotion. I've made videos about those if you'd like to see that as well. In this film, these new emotions show up. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no main taxonomy of emotion that includes these new emotions of envy and embarrassment and ennui. Anxiety is normally thought of as more of a higher order cognitive state. So rather than being an emotion, it's the emotion and the pattern of thinking of worry and apprehension on top of that. Now, one thing I really liked about this film is the way it portrayed anxiety. It would have been extremely easy to make anxiety the villain, the enemy, without redeeming qualities. What was really smart about this film is the way that it portrayed anxiety as just another emotion, but an emotion which had the propensity to lead to downward spirals. So, what happens in the film, and I'm not going to give away the ending, is basically anxiety takes over Riley's mind. These other emotions are thrown away, suppressed emotions literally put into a jar, and these other emotions have to work together to stop anxiety. And what anxiety is doing, getting her mind to constantly focus on all the bad things that could possibly happen, and then that leads to bad and unpleasant things happening, and then to focus on that even more. And so we've got this downward spiral of worry and apprehension, exacerbated by the negative events that causes and is caused by. So this downward spiral. It would be very easy to show anxiety as just the villain, this nasty, nasty emotion we need to stop. But what the film does, especially in the way it introduces anxiety, is that it shows that anxiety is actually trying to help. And the way anxiety explains what it's doing is fear. This is a quote from the film. Fear protects Riley from all the things she can see. I protect her from all the things she can't. And that's exactly what anxiety is the psychological state which gets you to prepare for uncertain threats, things that could go wrong. Maybe everything is fine, or maybe everything is falling apart. We don't know. So what anxiety is trying to do is anxiety is trying to help. Anxiety is saying these are all the things that could happen to Riley that could go wrong. And so what anxiety is doing is weaponizing her imagination in order to try to prepare her for all the things that could possibly go wrong. And it shows in the film that this can actually be beneficial, but left to its own devices without any other emotions to get involved, without any other emotion stopping it, the anxiety can lead to this negative spiral. Now, one of the jobs that the emotions have in this film is to protect Riley's sense of self, which is displayed as kind of a ball of these different colorful fibers. And the sense of self is basically a core belief. So what happens in the film is Riley has all of these different experiences, these different memories that kind of pool together to create a sense of who she is. It maps onto the cognitive psychology of Aaron Beck. So Aaron Beck was the cognitive psychologist who developed cognitive behavioral therapy. And one thing that he studied was beliefs which were important for your psychological health. So this core belief, sense of self, is a quote from Riley saying, "I'm a good person." And that really maps onto Beck's research that one of the foundational beliefs for psychological health is the belief in your own intrinsic worth. And what anxiety is doing throughout the film is it's trying to protect Riley by getting her to imagine all these terrible things that could possibly happen in order to work really hard to prepare for them. And a lot of the time that backfires throughout the film. And so anxiety is telling Riley, these are the things that could go wrong. And so this is what you have to do. If you do this, if you do this, if you join the hockey team, if you abandon your old friends, if you do these things, then everything will be fine and you will be safe. because anxiety wants to keep us safe. And so what's happening throughout the film is anxiety has thrown away this old core belief and is trying to rebuild a new one. And anxiety discovers, to its absolute shock and dismay, that when it's created this new belief, the new belief just says, I'm not good enough. Because by making conditional statements, if you do this, if you do that, that's telling Riley you're not good enough by yourself. You're only good enough if you meet some particular criteria for success. And so what I really liked is that by the end of the film, anxiety wasn't suppressed. At the end of the film, anxiety wasn't suppressed and put into some jar and thrown away to the back of the mind. Anxiety wasn't an evil villain that was thrown away at the end. What happened is the emotions recognized anxiety is really helpful. Anxiety is here to do a good job. But the problem comes when anxiety is allowed to take over your attention and to take over the imagination. So that kind of maps onto what's happening in cognitive behavioral therapy, where it's trying to get you to think of possible explanations for phenomenon which were not explained by threats or were not explained by negative core beliefs, for example. The film does a really good job of showing that all of these emotions are helpful. And it's not that you have good emotions and bad emotions, they're all trying to do some particular job in order to keep you safe. If you're interested in psychology, particularly the psychology of emotions, I would highly recommend watching this film.